So let me start out with, there's a few personal anecdotes, just like in my book. So go back and forth between personal stuff and science. So on the left side, this is my grandfather in 1920. So in our family, there's been this confectionery shop for 6 generations. So I'm the first one who did not continue this tradition. The reason I'm showing this, so 1920, so for several reasons. One is I certainly got my dose of high sugar food for the first 12 or 15 years of my life before I moved away to go to university, which is, I don't think has really harmed me, so it's kind of a good news. The second one is that it really, this time period coincides with this beautiful illustration by a physician who lived in Berlin at the time, Fritz Kahn, who drew a whole series of images of the body, kind of reflecting how medicine at the time was really seeing it. And you see this really reflecting the Industrial Revolution. So people at the time saw the body, in the Western world, saw the body really as a conglomerate of mechanical parts that did very similar things as our man-made machines did. So what has happened since then in these 100 or so years? Several revolutions in science have happened, and they're actually going on. I hopefully will be able to convince you that we're in the midst of a paradigm shift, which has become possible because of the data processing capabilities that we have. One is we have been able to look into the brain and identify all the connections between brain regions, so the so-called brain connectome. We've also made tremendous strides in characterizing the immune system and its interconnections. And then the newcomer to this in the last 10 years or so has been the microbiome, something that has really energized the scientific community in an unprecedented, not just scientific community, but also the lay public in an unprecedented way. Not sure why that fascination has sort of come along with this discovery. And what I'm going to try to convince you is there's an interaction between all these 3 elements. Didn't display the genetic revolution that's happened at the same time. All these revolutions have really been driven by our ability to process massive amounts of data, and that has been accelerated really by the microbiome research, where we're dealing with an unprecedented number of organisms and players. So in my view, what is happening, we see this paradigm shift from the image that I showed you before, the mechanical device from the industrial age, to a supercomputer explaining how these different systems interact with each other and how that interaction is essential for our health, and disruptions are underlying many of our chronic diseases. So you'll see this image in several variations throughout the talk. What I want to emphasize right from the beginning, that in my research and so also writing the book, it's become pretty clear that the brain and its mind and the gut and the microbes are intricately interconnected. You cannot separate them. If you want to understand diseases that in any way involve one of those parts, they're always brain-gut microbiome diseases, and hopefully be able to convince you throughout the presentation. So these are images kind of representing the different chapters in my book, starting out with this supercomputer image, and then I'll go through all these topics as are listed here. You may not realize at the beginning, if you haven't read the book, that such different types of images and ideas could be interconnected through the brain-gut microbiome axis, but hopefully at the end of this presentation you'll agree with me. So starting out with Microbe Speak. So one unique thing about microbes is that apparently, from what we know now, they're able to communicate with all our organ systems, including the brain and the nervous system in our gut, the enteric nervous system. So clearly they must speak some kind of language that's being understood by our bodies as well, and I'll get in a lot more details of this. So the microbes, we now know humans have about 100 trillion of these invisible creatures. So the paradox is that they're not visible, they're not culturable, most of them. But now with these sequencing techniques, we're able to actually count the numbers. Most of those 100 trillion microbes, we don't really know what they represent and what organisms and their function. So this is an ongoing process. If you could put them all together, they would be a substantial size, but the liver, of the human liver, larger than the brain and larger than the heart. You can see some of the numbers here. The cells, if you take these 100 trillion cells, about the same number of cells that our human bodies are made of. So we have human, have microbial. Some people have made the joke after you go to the bathroom, you're actually more human for a while because you're going to get rid of a few 100,000 or billion of your microbes. Even more interesting than their sheer numbers is really what they can produce, and that's reflected in their gene count. You know, humans, we have about 25,000 genes. They clearly outnumber us in several orders of magnitude. Probably 400 times, we estimate between 300 and 400 times more microbial genes in this combined organism that we represent than human genes. And that means they can produce a lot of different molecules and do a lot of things. Most of those we don't really know yet, these functions. In principle, what they do is and this is probably the reason they have evolved, they are able to break down undigestible products that we don't have the enzymes or the transport mechanisms in our gut. So these are primarily all the fibers and undigestible components of plant-based foods that also have a caloric value, but if you didn't have the microbes, we would lose that with our bowel movement. So in evolution, this was a very adaptive way of harvesting more calories from the kind of food that our ancestors ate, most of which was very high in fiber components. But they also do other things, like amongst the many functions, just want to emphasize that one. So xenobiotics are chemical entities, molecules that our organisms have never seen during evolution. So most of our medications, chemicals, pesticides, and the microbes have a unique ability, probably based on their vast gene count and the things that they can do, to transform these molecules, making them inactive in some cases, possibly making them to metabolites that are harmful. For example, with glyphosate, or the compound that's in Roundup, that human cells cannot metabolize, but the microbes can, and the metabolites from that almost certainly have some effect on the human host that we currently don't understand. In addition to producing all these substances and helping us to harvest a significant amount of, so it's been estimated that some 20% of the caloric intake of our ancestors on a plant-based diet was actually harvested and rescued by these microbes and turned into substances that we can absorb, like so-called short-chain fatty acids. But we now know that with these molecules that they produce, both the ones that they can synthesize, so they can synthesize, and I'll show you this in a second, but also the metabolites from breaking down these undigestible foods, they can send those through the bloodstream or via nerve pathways all over our bodies, including the central nervous system and also the enteric nervous system, the nerves in our gut. There's fascinating stories, for example, about the heart. There's a metabolite that is a major risk factor of coronary vascular disease, which is increased in people that eat a lot of kangaroo meat. So I guess it's limited to Australia, to people that drink a lot of these high energy drinks that have carnitine in it. So I was very skeptical when, even though in my lab we had studied brain-gut interactions for some 35 years, but I was very skeptical when the first news came out from animal studies that somehow the microbes play a role in this gut-brain communication and that they could do all kinds of things to the behavior of the animals. So we did this study reluctantly, really. We had a sponsor. We did not think something positive would come out of this, so we took healthy young women, enrolled them in a study, a 4-week study, where they would ingest a yogurt with a probiotic mix in it, so not just the yogurt microorganisms, but also 3 other microorganisms. And the hypothesis was that with this intake of this probiotic, we could actually change the function of the microbes, either their composition or their function. So probably most people in this audience who believe in the health benefits of probiotics or yogurt or other types of things believe that you can change the composition of your gut microbiome. That did not happen in this study. There was no change in that, but the molecules that they produced and they got into the circulation or freed within the gut, they did change. And the way we detected this is we asked participants to do this emotional recognition task where they have to match the emotion of one of the lower 2 faces with the upper one. So standardized tests been used in hundreds of study subjects. And then at the same time we looked at their brain and collected these functional brain images. And we were particularly interested of how these brain regions that are engaged by this emotional recognition task, how they're connected with each other, so how tight that network of emotion dependent brain regions is. And what happened to our big surprise is that the connectivity of this network decreased, so there was less of a coherence of these regions in the individuals that had ingested the probiotic compared to 2 placebo conditions where they ate a non-fermented milk product or didn't do anything. So that was the first demonstration, and believe it or not, it's remained the only convincing human study that has mimicked the animal findings. There's a growing number of these animal studies that show that all kinds of behaviors in mice can change. But this remains the only study. We now have several others in press who are coming out actually next week that sort of seem to confirm that. So this was important, and after that our group got really excited, and now all our studies involve or include looking at the microbiome. These were totally healthy women. They were not anxious, they were not depressed, they didn't have any chronic pain. So we don't know if we had done the same study in individuals and patients with elevated anxiety, if that would have been reflected in it. So I cannot answer the question, did this have any psychological benefit for the individuals? So a big question is why the microbes are able to communicate with our brain. So I think we're so in some ways egocentric that everything is impossible that microbes I mean, I was assuming that the microbes had learned it from our nervous system, from our hormones, that had taken up these communication molecules. But you'll see the story is quite different. So if you look at the evolutionary history on planet Earth, for 3.5 billion years, there were only the microbes, vast numbers, the biggest biomass that has ever existed on the planet, invisible, but bigger than the dinosaurs. And they had time for 3.5 billion years to optimize and perfect the system by which they communicated with each other. About 500 million years ago, something really interesting happened. So the very primitive marine animals, like the hydra, shown here, which is essentially a floating gastrointestinal tract, has the same, it's kind of amazing, has the same peristalsis. So if something gets into its mouth, it's driven by a peristaltic wave and it's expelled at the end. If it's something toxic, they can reverse the peristalsis and vomit, basically. And what's equally exciting is you see this net around this floating tube. That was the first nervous system, really, that has come up in evolution. Really the first brain, the enteric brain. And then the third thing that happened, which was really monumental in evolution, that the microbes, some of these microbes decided to move into the into the inside of this creature and develop interactions with their host. And that became possible because the molecules that they had come up with, these communication molecules, had a target in the intestinal tract and in the nerves, on the nerves of this primitive animal. And then through a process called lateral gene transfer, the microbes that settled in increasing numbers could exchange their genes that encoded their signaling molecules with the host, and so our neurotransmitters and our hormones really originate from this process that took 3.5 billion years to come up with these designs. So it's kind of amazing thing. Now, after this happened for the first time, it turned out to be so successful that all animals and creatures afterwards maintained this concept of a symbiosis between the microbes and the host. So every ant and bee, fly, butterfly, all the mammals have maintained that same principle, obviously in different complexities. But this has big implications. For example, this colony, this dying off of the bees, colony distress disorder, I've forgotten now the exact term. When they look at the bees at their intestinal at the microbiome, it's significantly altered, probably through the pesticides that they're exposed to. So this has it's really important for the health of all the hosts that harbor this. And if you perturb it, it's likely that disturbances in the healthy state occur. So finally, from this first brain in our gut, it was the blueprints were transferred into the central nervous system to essentially reconcile non-GI, non-digestion related signaling with the behavior of humans. But the design has been kept that all the sorry for this, that all the functions for digestion were kept in this first nervous system, this enteric nervous system, where all the higher functions moved into the central nervous system. So now we know why they can communicate, and I'll show you a few examples how much we have learned about this. So 3 players in this communication, the gut microbes, the immune system, and the central nervous system. There's many ways that they can communicate with each other, the microbes directly with the brain. You see some of these mechanisms listed here. The microbes with the immune system, and I'll say a little bit more about this in greater detail. And then the immune system with the brain. And what's also important, they are bidirectional interactions. So it's not just that the brain receives all the messages from the microbes. The brain can tell the microbes what to do as well. And so talking about how the microbes and the immune system interact, so let me start out with, so on the right side you have all the CNS disorders and processes that have been identified that are in some ways connected with the with microbial molecules. So on the left side you see all the different microbes and the species and strains and taxa of microbes. Here you see the lining of the gut, and here you see the various immune cells that have been identified that respond to microbial signals. So this has turned on into a very complex interaction by which different groups of microbes in your gut can communicate with different types of immune cells. These immune cells producing substances that enact on various brain functions, both in health and in disease. So for example, in Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, these altered immune signaling to the brain have been identified. So these neuroinflammatory disorders. What's new now is that we now know a big role in this input comes from the microbes. So this was kind of the introductory part of the book. So let me go through a few of the chapters. Obviously, you'll have to read the book if you want to really know the details. So one is gut reaction. So we all use that term, gut reactions. And the way I've sort of separated this from gut sensations, which I'll tell you in a minute, is that it's all the signals that the brain sends to the gut, and the gut reacts to these signals. And just based on statistics, I would imagine about 15% of people sitting in this audience have experienced symptoms that are related to these abnormal or excessive gut reactions. Irritable bowel syndrome is one of those disorders that prevalence of 15% in the general population. And just in the most general terms, emotional stimuli or stressors are often pretty normally in everybody associated with contractions and different changes in gut function, not just contraction, but secretion and blood flow, and as we'll know, also a change in the gut microbial function. So we know quite a bit about this, and this is what we have been studying this for decades, really. So stress, in very simple terms, acts on certain systems within the brain. There's a molecule called corticotropin releasing factor. This is the general switch in the brain to change to a stressful, to orchestrate the entire stress response. What's always associated with that activation is signals, so-called autonomic nervous system signals that go down to the gut, and that essentially innervate all the different components of your gut, the blood flow, the secretion, the permeability, the transit. So every time you're on the go, this kind of a stimulus, no matter if you feel something in your gut or if you don't feel it, you will have a reflection at the gut level, so this so-called gut reaction. And what we're realizing now that this is not just the gut itself, but also the microbes living in it and what they produce. So stress is bad for you. We all know this, but it's particularly bad because we have these reactions. Everybody has these reactions, and if you have them chronically, it will ultimately change what goes on inside of your gut, and it's amplified by the bacteria that send the signaling molecules all over your body. Just give you one example, which is really fascinating. So when you're stressed or anxious, this stress mediator norepinephrine, all of you know this, will increase, and you will feel it because your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you get sweaty palms. But also what we now know that this molecule leaks into the gut lumen. We had known this for about 15 years, but nobody really paid attention to it. So now we know that it gets into the gut lumen. It acts on some of the microbes that live in your gut lumen, which have specific receptors. So it kind of emphasizes the same language that we as hosts and the microbes speak. And then what happens is that the gene expression in these microbes changes, so they become nastier bugs. They either start attacking you as the host, or if you have an infection, a gastroenteritis, it will lead to a longer lasting and more severe gastroenteritis. So don't go to a restaurant in Mexico that you don't know when you're severely stressed, because chances are that you're going to suffer from the symptoms much longer than somebody who goes there in a very relaxed state. This has now been shown for many different organisms, and norepinephrine is just one hormone where we know this. Probably all the hormones that are stored in our gut can have a similar effect. We don't know yet what these effects are on the microbes and their function and how they talk back to us. So another chapter is about emotions. I mean, obviously stress and emotions are kind of related to each other. But let me just show you what we know about the emotions. So each of us recognize the emotional facial expression. I showed you earlier that study that we did where we used this to stimulate certain centers of the brain by looking at faces like that. But what almost nobody realizes that this always, just like the facial expression is of your skeletal musculoskeletal system, the same thing, an analogous thing happened at the gut level. So when you are fearful, you slow down the emptying and the peristalsis of your stomach, you increase it of the end of your large intestine, and you speed up things in the small intestine in between. When you're angry, this changes, the stomach goes into spasms. The same thing at the other end of the digestive tract. And sadness and depression, the activity of the GI tract decreases. And we'll come back to this later. So in patients with depression, we now know they have a very different composition of their gut microbes. The same with anxiety. So most likely, the microbes find a different environment, a different context in which they live, depending on our emotional expression. So again, the warning is, if you're somebody who spends a lot of their time thinking about sad things, or is very anxious or fearful or angry, sort of the Buddhist philosophy that negative emotions are not worthwhile dwelling on, that's probably a very good reason for that, because it will go down, it will be reflected in your inside of your body. And now that we know the microbes are very sensitive to that, it will have generalized effects on your health and on your the rest of your organs. So the model that then you're going to recognize, this sort of circular model that I've shown you earlier, that any process, any emotional process that goes on at the brain level, activates all these different networks, will always be reflected at the gut level. There's all these cells that are interconnected with each other, including the microbes. We call it the gut connectome. And then these changes generate signals that go back to the brain and reinforce or perpetuate the symptoms how it started out with in the first place. So all of you know how difficult it is to break the emotion of anger. You can get stuck in that. The brain alone wouldn't do that. So it has the body as an echo chamber that sends back signals that reinforces that emotion. And also it's true that there's a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms. Many patients suffer from these. They don't really get satisfactory answers from their gastroenterologist. There's no good therapies. I mean, the way that at our center we understand these, that there's always a component at the brain level that is reflected here. And in order to break that vicious cycle, and somebody has too many of these symptoms, you have to address both ends of the brain-gut axis. So I want to, and I should emphasize, so the model that I've sort of that I like to represent is that the gut reactions, where the brain sends down the signals, so the yang, and the gut sensations and signals that go back up to the brain is the yin. So just like the yin-yang concept, these are intricately connected with each other, and you can't really separate them. So this cell, there's this one cell that I wanted to draw your attention to. This is the lining of the gut. And here's the cell interspersed between the regular gut cells. These are the cells that are called enterochromaffin cells, and they contain more than 95% of our entire store of serotonin. It's not in the brain, and it's not, so, you know, SSRIs are one of the most commonly prescribed drugs with indication of depression and anxiety. It's always been assumed that the main effect is on the brain serotonin mechanisms, but it's equally possible or very plausible that part of this effect actually is a result of interfering with these cells that line the gut. And I'll show you something about this, how fascinating this system is, because it links diet, stress, and the microbes and the brain together in a very unique way. And I'm sure this model will be applied to many other hormones that are stored within our gut. So these are these enterochromaffin cells filled with serotonin. This is the enzyme that makes serotonin. We know that the microbes produce substances from their carbohydrate digestion, these short-chain fatty acids, or from metabolizing the bile acids that come from the upper GI tract. And these molecules can stimulate this enzyme that produces serotonin. It seems like about 50% of the serotonin synthesis are due to microbial signals influencing that system. When these cells are activated, they release serotonin. We now know they have these neuron-like extensions called neuropods, and they form synaptic connections with the vagal sensory nerve fibers that take that signal right into your limbic part of your brain. So that's already fascinating that the microbes would have a direct access through the serotonin to our emotion regulating system and the autonomic nervous system output. But it sort of gets even more interesting because the microbes are influenced by what we eat, so that's kind of the main way where we influence them. And foods that are high in tryptophan basically stimulate the microbes to release these molecules and start this serotonin synthesis. The microbes themselves can't produce serotonin, so the serotonin that's released from these cells acts back on the microbes and influences their behavior. So this is a good example for interconnectedness between what we eat. So these are probably good things, including chocolate. Particularly good for women who have a lower activity of this enzyme that synthesizes serotonin. Probably the reason why women are more likely to become chocolate addicts and compared to men. The interaction of that, and then there's another thing that makes this connectedness even more intriguing. So the brain, via the autonomic nervous system, sends down signals that can activate these cells. So everybody really here talks to each other, and the balance of this multi-directional dialogue ultimately determines our background emotional state. So this is one of the earliest studies that sort of stimulated the interest of the scientific community, but also the lay media. So experiments done with so-called germ-free mice. So these are mice that have grown up without any microbes on their bodies or inside. And when investigators transplanted fecal material with the microbiome from an animal that's genetically more timid, less aggressive, less exploratory, into a germ-free mice that has a different genetic background, the opposite, then the recipient develops the exact behavior of the donor. So simply by transferring the fecal material with the microbes to these animals makes them adopt a behavior that you saw in the donor animal. So that was almost like, that was hard to believe at the time. In the meantime, it's been repeated. It's a very artificial system, so obviously we don't have germ-free study subjects where we can reproduce this, but it certainly indicated that this communication, and the yogurt study that we did confirmed that some form of communication exists in humans. In the meantime, depression actually has become the one human example where this has been documented the most, and it probably will have the earliest implications for novel treatments. What's shown here is basically they took stool samples from 100 patients with major depressive disorder. They were untreated, did these microbial analysis, so-called 16S sequencing, and then they did an analysis that's called principal component analysis, where you kind of can separate the participants based on their microbial signature. And you can see, so the red points are the patients with major depressive disorder, and the blue ones, the healthy controls. So simply based on their microbial composition, you could identify who was depressed and who was not depressed. And you can see this a little bit. So these are the frequencies of the individual microbes. So you can see there's less green here, there's more blue and less red. So the ratio of the three dominant taxa in the stool of these depressed individuals changed significantly, was different between those. And what they did, which is so really suggests that there is a causal relationship, doesn't prove it, but suggests it. So when they took the fecal material from the depressed patients, put them into these germ-free mice that were normal in their behavior, they developed depression-like behavior. So there's a series of behaviors that scientists can identify as this. So there's now 3 studies that have shown the same thing, so I think we can pretty much assume that certain bacterial compositions in our gut that are more frequent in patients with depression can induce depression if they're transferred into another animal. Obviously, we're never going to do this in humans, but it just shows that this field has come a long way from the earliest experiments that we've seen. So I don't want to dwell any more into the models that are evolving now of how the brain changes come first. Most likely in depression, they change the gut, they change the microbes, microbes feed back, and you develop this vicious cycle that is hard to break with many of the therapies, and it's not possible to break it in many patients that suffer from severe depression. So another chapter of the book deals with gut feelings. So this is sort of also very common in the lay language. When I wrote the book, I paid attention in the media how often that expression is being used. It's really remarkable. There's not a week that goes by that somebody says, some politician or some actor or somebody has made a decision based on their gut feelings. I'm going to talk about two experiences, one personal, the other one sort of much more, with much wider consequences. So the personal experience was, this was in 1977, I traveled with a friend backpacking through South America, climbing all the big volcanoes there. This is Chimborazo in Ecuador. And this was already way into the rainy season. So when we talk to people in Quito, I talk to them that we want to climb this mountain, they say, you're crazy, this is against any logic, it's dangerous. And so my friend is a really experienced climber, so didn't want to hear about this. He definitely wanted to climb this mountain. So what happened, we went to the base camp. It was pouring rain at the base camp. There were 10 Americans there that have been sitting there for 2 weeks waiting for better weather. And my friend Paul said, I think we have to climb this tonight. So my gut feeling tells me we have to climb this tonight. So we woke up, there was a full moon, there were no clouds in the sky. This shows, as we left about at 1 o'clock in the morning, this is sort of halfway up the mountain. And then at noon, we stood on top of this mountain. We went down, the rain came back, and it was closed again, probably for the rest of the season. So I've always admired this friend of mine because he has made many of those decisions based on his gut feelings. And I'll provide you with a possible explanation of, I've always tried to figure out how he does this. So I think now I would put the gut feeling-based decision-making pretty high on my list. So the example of gut feelings had much more serious, potential serious consequences. Happened in the 1980s, where this Russian military person, Stanislav Petrov, who was in the missile defense system outside of Moscow, and they got the warning, the flashing lights on their warning system that there were 5 incoming US intercontinental missiles. So his instructions were that he really had to launch the counterattack, which he did not do. And then people have asked him, he got in big trouble with the Russian politicians, the military, basically not following orders. And he didn't say this for a long time. In the meantime, people have made a film about him and written a book about him. So ultimately, he said he did it based on his gut feelings. He can't really explain how he made this decision. There were obviously a few rational points that he said, so unlikely that the US would only send 5 missiles over there that it just didn't make sense to him. But this is an example, and there's many examples of politicians making very fundamental decisions about life and death of the planet almost that are based on this. So some very important mechanism that we have in our brain. So if you look at what's different between our normal rational decision making that we indoctrinate in our children from day one when they're born, the better they are in this, the better they're going to do in school, the better they do in their careers, seemingly in their careers. So it's a slow, linear, objective process, weighing multiple options, take advice from others, and evaluating data. So we know exactly what systems in the brain do that. If you look at this gut-based decision making, it's rapid, intuitive, subjective, deeply personal. And as Daniel Kahneman said, the secret author of many of the choices and judgments we make, even though we're trained to do the opposite. So ultimately, I think this is our default way of making our most important decisions. So how could this be? Part of this is hypothetical, but it's been supported also by other authors and scientists, Antonio Damasio, for example, in his outstanding books. So the idea is that we get signals from the body, and particularly from the complex world that our gastrointestinal tract with its microbes is. They go every millisecond to our brain when we sleep, or if we don't sense 99.9% of any of these signals, even though they go on all the time. They get to a particular brain area called the insula, and they are integrated, they're stored. Only a very small amount of these, I said like probably 0.1 to 0.5%, actually become conscious in the form of gut feeling. So you have a feeling that you want to do something or need to do something. And there's many other factors like stress, affect, attention, and particularly memory that goes into that computation that happens based on the gut sensations that make it to the brain. So I found another sort of really interesting example of how you could explain that. So Damasio called this the somatic marker hypothesis, that we form these memories, these emotional memories from day one we're born in our brain, but the signals come from the body. I believe most of them come from the GI tract because it's the most complex part of our bodies. And so I saw this at the Biennale in Venice a few years ago. This was an exhibit, modern art exhibit. Can't really see what this is from a distance. It looks interesting, but if you look at it, so all these little things are video screens where people talk about their personal life experiences, which runs. So there's thousands of these emotional, personal, subjective video clips that are displayed in this in this exhibit. So in my opinion, that's a very good example or illustration of what goes on within our brain, that we constantly store these personal experiences, not just the way we felt there, but also with the signals that came from the gut. And what we do when we make these gut-based decisions, just like a Google engine, so we can't go through each of those previous experiences, we have a way, in a nonlinear way, to access this database instantaneously, just like all the modern things like that Amazon or Netflix or Google uses to make these personal judgments. So this is, like, overall, it's a model. I find it very intriguing. It fits with what other authors have written about. But it could explain why we're able to make these phenomenal decisions in a second without really analyzing all the plus and minuses that would go into a different kind of decision making. So another chapter about early memories. This is a very important one because so our center has had long-standing interest in adverse early life events before the microbes, and how that has also been a big topic in psychiatry, how that affects our emotional systems in development. There's been a lot of writing and a lot of science about this, that the first 18 years of life, our brain is plastic and will respond to any of these events, like separation of the parents, death or severe illness of the primary caregiver, normally the mother, physical, emotional, verbal, sexual abuse. They all seem to have a similar kind of effect on our emotional brain development. But what we now know is that the microbes play a very big role in this, in a parallel way. So the early science about the emotional circuits in the brain were all based on the effects on the brain of these early life events. Now we know a lot of influences that affect the microbiome, and the way then the microbiome signals back to the brain. It starts prenatally. So maternal infections, a major risk factor for example, schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorders. The maternal nutrition, medications that are taken during pregnancy. Once it comes to the birth, the mode of delivery, vaginal versus C-section, also the nutrients that the infant gets the first couple of years in life, so breastfed versus formula fed. There's lots of studies, all of which have shown that they can influence the gut microbes, the development. The period of plasticity as opposed to the nervous system is shorter. It's the first 3 years of life where the microbiome establishes itself. So you can imagine that the first 3 years are particularly dangerous because you have both the nervous system development and the microbial development at the same time. So anything that happens in those first 3 years is really crucial. And one factor that is very important to mention is the influence of antibiotics. Probably of all the drugs that are being taken during this time period, they're the most important. And they not only affect the infant's microbiome, but also have a detrimental effect if they act on, if the mother takes those during pregnancy. So coming back to the slide I showed you earlier, the early life events essentially program the interactions between the microbes, their signaling molecules, and the end effect on brain development. So probably the most important influence on your gut microbiome and your brain development related to gut microbiome happens during early life. And when I listen to my patients, probably the majority will give some example of early of these adverse early life events. So it's something that's quite common. Initially, people thought it has to be sexual abuse, which is actually the least common, but the other factors are very prevalent. And unfortunately, most patients and probably most mothers are not aware of the seriousness of these influences on the development of the child. So here's some data about the antibiotic use. So more than 73 billion doses are given worldwide to all people. 258 million courses in the US only in 2010. And this is probably the most worrisome, 2.7 courses by age 2 and 10.9 courses by age 10 that kids get for most likely viral illnesses. So any sore throat, respiratory tract infection. Often the mothers twist the channel practitioner's arm. My child suffers so much, you need to give him an antibiotic. So it's and this practice has not really changed, unfortunately. So if you look at this, if you look at some of the diseases that we see as adults or as adult physicians, or look at our relatives, some have Parkinson's, some have Alzheimer's, we don't realize that there's a long process that starts really very early in life. We talked a lot about this the first 3 years. The development of these brain circuits is influenced both by the gut microbes and their metabolites, but also by the external events, later the chronic stress. So a lot of epigenetic changes. So these are not just intermittent changes that go away if you change the stimulus, but if they affect stem cells, they could actually persist then. And so when we see when I see a patient that comes to me at 30 or 40 or 70 years of life, this is something you have to think about, that many of the things were set into motion very early on, were asymptomatic throughout most of life, but then manifest after a lifetime of dysregulation within the brain-gut microbiome interactions. Okay, the Northamerican Diet. So this might be the most popular topic. So based on my experience with audiences, no matter how much I think the gut feelings are important and Stanislav Petrov's story is important, the diet clearly trumps that. So all of us know that in the last 30 or 40 years or so, our diet has evolved into something not very good for us. High amounts of salt, sugar, animal fat, processed foods that contains all of these. Non-caloric sweeteners. Most people in our GI division at lunchtime, when they have when they pick their soda, it's always the diet Pepsi or zero Coke, not realizing that has the same negative effect on your gut microbial interaction with the gut as sugar has. And then emulsifiers. For all of these, it's been shown that they change the microbial composition and the signaling, and then have a very serious consequence, which has sort of been summarized under this heading of an inflammatory diet. So probably a lot of people have heard this term. It's in the lay press, that what we eat sort of causes this low-grade inflammation in our body. And there's a lot of evidence that each of those substances or components contributes to that. Obesity being a huge problem. Started with these experiments, the same type of experiments I showed you earlier. Starting with a genetically altered obese mouse that becomes obese because it just eats non-stop when its food is available. If you take the fecal material, transplant it into a lean, germ-free mouse without its own bacteria, that mouse will also become obese and will also start to overeating. So it's not that this transplant allowed the microbes to harvest more the undigestible calories. It's because something that the microbes produce drives their eating behavior. And so let's talk a few minutes about this concept of low-grade inflammation in our gut and our bodies and what relationship this has to the diet and to the obesity. This shows a schematic of, so by now you probably recognize this easily, these are the gut cells. They're very tightly linked to each other, so the gut permeability is very low. There's also a mucus layer that certain microbes produce. So we have these two mechanisms that make this a really tight barrier in a healthy condition. And the circumstances that this is healthy are shown here. So a high intake of plant-based foods that increase the diversity and abundance of the microbes and produce short-chain fatty acids, increase the number of particular microbes that produce the mucus, like this Akkermansia microorganism. And there's really no transmission, negative transmission in terms of the immune system to the rest of the body. So what happens with the high-fat, high-sugar diet? You see that the mucus layer has almost disappeared. So this organism, Akkermansia, that produces mucus diminishes almost completely, is replaced by others. And also the tightness between these epithelial cells in the gut is lost, and now they become permeable. So you lose both of these barrier mechanisms, the mucus and these tight links. Now a lot of inflammatory substances can get to the immune system of the gut, but also into the circulation. So for example, there's a substance called lipopolysaccharide. It's basically part of the membrane of certain microbes. They can get into the blood, and it's an inflammatory molecule that you can measure, for example, in obese patients or obese individuals. It goes to the fat, turns the fat into an inflammatory organ, but also gets into the brain and can cause many changes. Like, for example, some of you may have heard about the leptin resistance. So a hormone that normally would shut off appetite in the hypothalamus, these inflammatory changes can make the hypothalamus insensitive to that, so you no longer get this satiety signal that turns off your appetite. So we heard, so I told you earlier that what's very important in the beginning to program the gut microbiome brain communication. With that programming, you're pretty much stuck with the system that you acquired early on. It's like if a city hires the musicians for a classical orchestra, these musicians will stay there for a long time, but they can play different tunes. So by changing the diet, we have a major influence of what happens, what type of signaling molecules are produced by the microbes, and can basically, despite the unchangeability of the composition, we still get major health benefits. And so just to show this to you again in another ways that the microbes produce many of these molecules that can activate the immune system that's located inside the gut. Then cytokines move throughout the body to the brain, change the blood-brain barrier, and then activate. So about half of the cells in your brain are not nerve cells, but they're immune-like cells. And these signals from the body, from the gut, can activate these cells to produce cytokines. So you develop basically an inflammation, low-grade inflammation of the brain, just by adhering to these unhealthy diets. So it's not just the obesity. People always are primarily obsessed with their weight and their cosmetic appearance. It's really the detrimental effect it has on our metabolism, in our fat cells, and in our brain. So metabolic syndrome clearly being one of the most rapidly rising health problems, and some of the others that I've listed here, less established, but certainly it's been hypothesized that this mechanism plays a role in all of these. So everybody pretty wants to know, is there an optimal diet? And I would say, in principle, the general prerequisites for an optimal diet are very simple. The details are more complicated. It depends on where you live. If you're an Inuit living on the North Pole, or if you're some Amerindian that lives on the Orinoco River, I'll come back to these people in a minute. They all have different metabolic needs, and so the diets that are optimal for them differ. And there's no shortage of advice. So, you know, if you go to Amazon, I'm always amazed about some of the titles. Very successful books, more successful than mine, because it's not as this is much more dramatic. You know, people want to know what this means. And it's really remarkable that almost every year somebody comes up with a new diet that's optimal for you. People also get mixed up between a diet that's good for weight loss, like a ketogenic diet, and a diet that is healthy for you in the long term, for your health and brain health. So going back again to some early experience that I had in my life, in my career. This was in the 80s. I had the opportunity to join a film expedition to the headwaters of the Orinoco River between Venezuela and Brazil. And there were these natives living in this area, the Yanomami Indians. At the time, I mean, I was a medical student, so only thing that fascinated us that they would not eat anything salty. They had a negative reaction to anything of salt. And they've been studied for this, but we didn't really know until much later. They also have another interesting characteristic. So this is the area where they live in the rainforest. We spent 2 months with them and sort of slept in the middle of them. We got our own hammock in the middle of all the other village inhabitants. And oops, good. So one thing that we now know from an investigator, Gloria Maria Dominguez, who went to this part of the world and, of all things, sampled their fecal material and analyzed. I don't know how you came up with this idea in the first place. Quite hard to go there, mosquito plagued, but they managed to get these stool samples, and they found that they had a very unusual gut microbiome composition, the most diverse of any human being in the world. So if you take this as a measure of a healthy gut microbiome, which many people do, the diversity and abundance, these people clearly have the most, the highest level of this. And I'll come back to this when we talk about the ecology and the loss of diversity that we've been experiencing. Now, if you go into the modern world, people have looked at what are the healthiest, the most health-promoting diets. And here it's just shown some of them. Most of the studies we really have for the Mediterranean diet. But if you look at these others, they're all similar in terms of their composition. So about 75% plant-based foods. The meat comes mainly from fish and from poultry. The Yanomami, also from fish and wild birds that they shot. Was always amazing in retrospect that they live in a world that's abundant with wild animals, from crocodiles to tapirs, but they have focused the diet on these health-promoting things. It's hard to understand how this evolved in evolution. So in addition to these types of diet, it is high plant-based, no red meat, high in fish and poultry. There's other things like the content of live microbiota in the diet. So if you look at most traditional diets around the world had very high concentrations of high amounts of diverse fermented foods, as opposed to in the US, everything is pasteurized. Until recently, everything has been pasteurized. And So typical Korean dinner with one main dish and some 20 or 30 side dishes that are all different kind of fermented fish, vegetables, each with a different combination of microbiota. So we don't know if these are really probiotics, because that by definition, you can only call a probiotic if it has a demonstrated health benefit on the human host. So we don't know this, but I would imagine if you eat from infancy on a vast amount of these microbes that interact, particularly early in life, so the Koreans start this not just as an adult, but early in life, that this would have a beneficial effect on the diversity. One thing that we do know from surveys, very difficult to do for psychiatric diseases in Korea because of the stigma that a psychiatric diagnosis has, so it's an underestimate really. But in terms of obesity, even though it has increased in the cities where people change from the traditional diet to a more Western diet with lots of beef and steaks on a daily basis, they have one of the lowest obesity rates in developed countries. So if that's related to their high microbiota containing diets, will need to be seen. Another thing that's interesting, I'm not sure if that has a health benefit. So the French are obviously cheese lovers. And there's an investigator at UCSD who is specialized in studying the microbes on different cheeses, not the cheddar that everybody does, the square orange cheddar, but these expensive and often bad-smelling cheeses that the Europeans, French and Dutch have. And so a couple of things are interesting. One is this is the rind of the cheese, so most of the microbes live in the rind, not in the center of the cheese. So don't cut the rind off if you want to do something good for your microbiome. Similar to the Korean dishes, each of these cheeses has its own combination of microbes, microbial communities that change over time. So if you eat a young cheese, it's different in its microbial mix than it's an aged cheese. But again, this is something in the North American diet. Many of these things that have been part of traditional diets, fermented foods and foods that contain a lot of microbes, have sort of been eliminated for hygienic reasons or increasing the shelf life of the products through pasteurization. So coming back to the Mediterranean diet, certainly one of my favorites, because when you go there, it's not just, doesn't just taste good, it has other aesthetic appealing properties. So typical landscape on the Adriatic coast in Italy. One thing that I want to emphasize here is the diversity of this agriculture. There's all these little patches of a whole range of different things that grow there seasonally. There's no, so Italians for a while tried to adapt to the North American model of making these huge monocultures of food. They went back to this because they realized that the quality of this food is different. Also, the high levels of seafood, particularly on the coasts, and vegetables. So somebody told me once in my career, anything that's very colorful is good for you. So now we can say that applies for the microbes as well. So many of these colorful plants, this is related to the antioxidants. And keep in mind the antioxidants that are in olive oil, in red wine, in grapes, and other colorful vegetables. Not all of those we absorb in our small intestine, but they're gobbled up by the microbes in the end of our small intestine and the colon, and they transform them into metabolites that probably have this health-enhancing effect on us. So this is basically, so optimal diet, 75% of the calories comes from food. The fat comes mainly from plant-based oils and fats, you know, then the meat mainly from fish and poultry. Very important part, this is where the mind comes in. So many investigators that did these studies commented on there's variability of the health benefits in these studies. And one factor that they identified was the social interaction that's sometimes lost in the big cities, but is present in smaller rural communities. And if anybody has gone to Italy and ever had a family meal with an Italian family can tell how important that is. I mean, how close people are interacting, both in the cooking and the eating. So the Mediterranean diet, this is the unique thing about this. So I don't know why people always ask, what diet can you recommend? If you want more evidence from well-controlled scientific studies for a whole range of chronic diseases, one study, a big study done in Spain, had to be stopped because the benefit in the treatment group that got the Mediterranean diet was so much greater that it would have been unethical to continue the study. Also, many studies using brain imaging look at brain function and brain structure. So why is that? So this diet is good for our gut microbes, high ratio of plant to animal-based foods, high ratio of plant-based unsaturated fats to animal fats, and the anti-inflammatory effects on the gut, the brain, and the body. So always remember that slide I showed you with what this diet does to your mucus layer and to your gut permeability, and what happens if you don't eat it, how you lose that. And then there's this high concentration of antioxidants and so-called polyphenols, particularly in olive oil that comes from older trees. Also fascinating that the older trees, the more polyphenol content the olives have. That, to me, indicates that these polyphenols are used by the plants to enhance their own health and defend themselves against diseases. So things coming from older olive trees, possibly from grapevines as well, have a higher content of these beneficial molecules. And many of them require the gut microbes to transform them into beneficial molecules. So I'm going to end with this, with the optimal health idea. That's obviously what we want to strive for. It's not what our healthcare systems, even though they call themselves healthcare systems, are really still mainly disease care or symptom-fixing entities. So from the intricate relationship between the brain, the mind, and the gut, and the microbes, all these connectedness, you would assume that optimal health can only be achieved if you target it at all these levels, and I'll add another level to it as well. So what has happened, coming back to the Yanomami, these are the curves of the diversity of the gut microbiome. And this was in the adults, so very high diversity, lowest diversity in North Americans, both so this is not just something that happens in the adults, they're infants. They compared the infants from the Yanomami with infants of families living in North American cities. You could see the same decrease, about a 40% decrease of diversity and abundance of microorganisms in North America. Let me just wrap this up. The data that if you show what happened in the Western world over the last 50 years, the diversity of our gut microbes have gone down consistently each decade. It's a process that has not stopped yet. If you think about what happens in other ecosystems around the world, if you decrease the diversity of species, you get to a point where the system becomes unstable, loses its resilience to diseases, to perturbations. And it's my opinion that what we see now with this epidemic of obesity, metabolic syndrome, that we're seeing the first evidence for that process. And I wouldn't be surprised if this continues unabated, we'll see many other chronic health issues rising dramatically for the same reason. Can't prove this right now, but certainly it fits with the vast information that we have from ecological theory. So to summarize, if you talk about optimal health, we have to talk about our own bodies, but we have to talk about the optimal health of the environment that we live in. There's microbes in the soil, there's microbes in the water. We have been leading a war against these microbes and continue to do it at various means. Decreasing diversity, for example, in agriculture, so these monocultures of corn, very different from what I showed you in this Italian landscape. use of fertilizers, use of pesticides, and all the things we pour into the water. So I think if you really want to talk about optimal health, we can't solve it just for our own benefit, our own health. We have to incorporate the taking care of the environment and changing the way that we produce our food and gain an awareness of this interconnectedness that I personally think that's a paradigm shift that's been triggered to a large degree by microbiome science, because you can't understand it by individual microbes. You have to use this ecological theory, and I would predict that we're entering a paradigm shift, not just in medicine, but also in looking at the world in general, realizing the interconnectedness, the benefits of diversity, very topical subject at the moment, so not just in civic life, but also for our health and the health of the environment.